Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Balie and welcome to this program, Was Freud Right All Along? A warm welcome also to those watching from home. So know that there is a live stream and there is room for questions after this long conversation. And if you ask a question, you're on video, just so you know. I'm Annegrietje Fransen. I'm a program maker, programmamaker at the Balie. But tonight I'm passing on the baton to my very special guest, Damiaan. He's a professor of psychiatry, philosopher, and a psychotherapist. And he will be on the seat of the interviewer this evening. And he'll further introduce both himself and our very special guest, Mark Solms, a renowned professor of neuropsychology and psychoanalysis. I'm very happy that I got all these terms out of the way in English. I'll leave the stage to them. After their conversation, as I said, there's room for questions. I'll come to you with a microphone. Have a lovely evening. And first, please give a big hand to Mark and Damiaan.
So thank you, Annegrietje. I just will start with some short introduction. So good evening again and welcome. Tonight we speak with Mark Solms, a thinker who has spent decades asking whether Freud's deepest intuitions can be formulated in the language of neuroscience. So the question tonight is not simply whether Freud was right or wrong. The deeper question is, can we understand mental suffering scientifically without losing the subject? The person who feels, dreams, desires, avoids, loves, and misunderstands himself. So, and allow me, as a short narrative before introducing Mark, to briefly introduce myself, because my own biography, my own struggle, explains why this conversation tonight matters so much to me. 40 years ago, I studied philosophy in Leuven. I'm from Belgium, and I encountered in philosophy psychoanalysis. And I was immediately fascinated. I thought, this is it. I will become a psychoanalyst. But then, in a moment of confusion, I imagined, maybe wrongly, that becoming a real psychoanalyst required first becoming a medical doctor. So I studied medicine, began my own analysis, and entered psychiatry. But the practice of psychiatry felt disappointing, and I moved to the Netherlands for academic research. I thought it would take me a few years, but I'm still here. And even more strangely, instead of becoming a psychoanalyst, I ended up at the absolute opposite pole, the most biological psychiatry possible, pioneering deep brain stimulation, implanting electrodes in the brain to treat mental disorders. So for 25 years, I worked with the brain in the most literal possible way. But in the end, that too felt incomplete, and I moved back to psychoanalysis, where I have been working for the last 4 years. So as you can see, I'm not an entirely stable person. And that's why I'm still in analysis. But there is one stable question running through my whole career. Is Freud right? Is psychoanalysis a truth about human beings? Or is it just a beautiful lie? Does it have a scientific foundation? Or is it just an emotional need? So, and then accidentally, or perhaps unconsciously, I had the chance to meet someone who combines both worlds, psychoanalysis and neuroscience. What are the odds? And tonight we have with us Mark Solms, who may finally give me, and hopefully you as well, the final answer. Was Freud right? So Mark Solms, as most of you know, is a South African professor of neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town. and one of the central figures in the creation of neuropsychoanalysis. His work has focused on dreams, affect, consciousness, brain mechanisms of subjectivity. And his recent book, The Only Cure, asks whether psychoanalysis can be understood as a major contribution to the future of mental health care. Neuroscience has given us extraordinary knowledge of the brain, and psychoanalysis has given us extraordinary language of the mind. And Mark Solms brings these two worlds together. Tonight, we will begin with discussing Solms' book, The Only Cure, and then move to the question of neuropsychoanalysis. And after that, the conversation is open to the audience. Please give a warm welcome to Mark Solms.
Voordat ons begin, dit is baie beïndrukkend vir my dat julle almal Engels praat in Amsterdam. So ek wil amper Nederlands, amper Itaal vir 'n oomblik praat. En dan sal ons in Engels oorgaan. En ek sal dit sê. Ek vra om verskoning vir die mense wat agter my sit. Dit snaaks dat ek moet vorentoe kyk en ek weet hulle is daar agter my. Ek's jammer. Dankie.
Thank you. Ja. We kunnen ook verder gaan in het Nederlands.
Nee, dankie.
No, Mark. Okay, thank you. So let's start. The title of your book, The Only Cure, feels a bit deliberately provocative. So in a world of medication, CBT, digital therapy, psychedelics, coaching, and so on, what do you mean with the only cure?
The emphasis in that title is on the word cure, and it alludes to the difference between treatments which aim at the causes of mental suffering and treatments that aim at the symptoms. And I think that it's not sufficiently appreciated, especially by the general public, that most psychiatric treatments, particularly, of course, the mainstay of psychiatric treatment being psychopharmacology, that these are symptomatic treatments. They aim at suppressing symptoms, which is no small thing when you're suffering depression or anxiety or whatever. You know, to be relieved of your symptoms is important, and in some cases, life-saving. But I think that it's important that we convey to the public that this is not treating the causes. You stop the treatment, the symptoms come back. Our talking cure, although it sounds so much less scientific because it's just talking, it seems like something much more fluffy, not real, proper medicine, actually aims at treating the causes of our patients' suffering. And therefore, when the treatment ends, the gains are maintained. And I'm sorry, I'm giving too long an answer, so let me just finish with this. When I say when we end the treatment, the gains are maintained, this is not a matter of opinion, and this is a matter of empirical fact. It's very solid meta-analyses, randomized controlled clinical trials, demonstrate that psychoanalytical treatment, even relatively short-term psychoanalytical treatments, bring about really significant symptom relief. And for those of you who measure things in terms of the standard medical terminologies, it's an effect size of about 0.8, which is highly effective treatment. And then after the end of the treatment, not only is the symptomatic improvement maintained, it actually continues to improve. This is called the sleeper effect, which I think is as strong a bit of evidence as you could hope for, that this is a treatment that has got hold of the cause.
So the only cure is psychoanalysis. You're very critical now, particularly about psychiatry, pharmacology, the DSM. It's like really hated. It's a mistake. It's a problem. So you argue that psychiatry risks losing the mind by reducing subjective suffering to brain illnesses. So what is lost when psychiatric distress is treated purely as a physical disorder? What do we lose?
So to start with the beginning of your question, which was a statement, it's true that I'm very critical of psychiatry. It's not true that I hate the DSM.
Sorry.
It's really not an emotive matter. And I think that this is important because it's become so silly, you know, that there's a kind of war between psychopharmacology
Polarized.
and psychoanalysis. Yes, and it doesn't do our patients any good. The authors, by which I mean the editors of the DSM, I think they themselves are critical of, you know, it really is a hodgepodge. We need to do much better. And in order to do better, we need a better understanding of what psychopathology is. So we've got this kind of superficial description of symptom complexes without any underlying kind of causal mechanisms which we can use to classify and of course thereby understand and most importantly then thereby treat these conditions. But to come to the end of what you said, which is really the question that you're asking, the psychiatry has, to put it flippantly, lost its mind. It is, in the very word psychiatry, it's a treatment of the psyche. There's another discipline called neurology, which is the treatment of the brain. And the fact that there are two disciplines points to a very important fact. Psychiatry is not about brain diseases. Psychiatry is about mind diseases. And in my view, the most interesting thing, I mean, as you said when I was introduced, my field is neuropsychology, and the name there also says it all, neuropsychology, you know, these two aspects. To me, the most interesting thing about the brain is that it has a subjective aspect. It's fascinating, it's wonderful, it's incredible, it's miraculous, you know, and for psychiatry to try to sort of airbrush out the subjective aspect, the idiographic, individual, personal aspect, is, I think, a tragedy.
Yeah.
I think that it's understandable where this all began, you know, that the material brain is a much more secure object of study scientifically. It's much more difficult to study subjective inner life of the mind.
So Mark, for you personally, you started with neuropsychology, but I had the impression that you became gradually dissatisfied because neuropsychology studied memory, language, behavior, while leaving out specifically the experience of remembering, speaking, desiring. So to you, psychoanalysis, was that a kind of a way bringing back subjectivity into science?
Yes, you say I gradually became disappointed with neuropsychology. It wasn't so gradual. It was, you know, very soon I realized that this is the second part of the word neuropsychology is not, it might as well have been called neurobehaviorism. Yes, what I learned was the mechanisms whereby language and memory and perception and executive function and so on are produced, but you have exactly the same kind of training in terms of the mechanisms of cardiac function and the mechanisms of respiratory function. And again, as I said in response to your previous question, what this leaves out of account is the way in which the brain differs from the heart or the lungs. You know, there is something it's like to be a brain, and you can't account for the special properties, the unique qualities of the brain if you don't also study it from the subjective point of view and understand what is all of this feeling and subjective being for. I mean, surely it does something. In my life, how I feel makes a big difference to what I do. So, you know, extrapolating from that to the general scientific sphere, you know, if we don't take account of the subjective life of the brain, we will never understand how it works. So I was terribly frustrated. I read a book, I trained in the early 1980s, and I read a book in 1984. Before he became famous, Oliver Sacks wrote a book called A Leg to Stand On. And in that book, there was a line which just caught it for me. He said, neuropsychology is admirable, but it ignores the psyche. And I thought, that's it. That's the problem with neuropsychology. And so I looked around for a discipline in the mental sciences that does not ignore the psyche, that takes the psyche as its starting point. In other words, the lived life of the mind. And there you go. With all of its faults, I found myself training in psychoanalysis.
So Yeah, when hearing this again, I mean, when I read your book, I was a bit puzzled because you seem to suggest that the function of the brain organ is having experiences. Like the beating is part of the heart, and like the liver is, I don't know, intoxicating or filtering things, detoxing. Yes. So that, to you, it's the function of the brain is having these experiences.
Exactly. This is the point, that if we leave out the experiential side, we won't understand how it works. And I was speaking sort of jokingly a moment ago, but it's not a joke. You know, if you just, all you need to do is look at your own life, and you can see, and like, I feel like this, so I'm going to do that. It's clear that what I do is consequent upon what I feel, and if you leave that out, you therefore will not understand what we do. It's as simple as that. And you know, and obviously, especially in psychiatry, where we're dealing with emotional disorders, our patients in psychiatry suffer mainly from feelings.
Yeah. So if you move to Freud, so if you had to explain Freud's discovery to a non-specialist, I mean, maybe there are some here in the room still non-specialists, what would you say? What is the major discovery of Freud? Is it the unconscious? Is it sexuality? Dreams? You worked on dreams. Is it repression? Or more fundamentally, is it the fact that the mind is divided against itself? What to you is the most, I mean, important contribution of Freud? What changed everything?
So let me preface my answer to that by saying that there are many things that Freud discovered which are now so generally accepted in mental science, in cognitive science, in neuroscience, that we forget that Freud discovered them. So, for example, the fact that very large swathes, if not the bulk of our cognitive life, is unconscious. When Freud said that, you know, there's an unconscious mental life, it was considered an oxymoron. You know, mind means consciousness. Now, nobody questions, you know, the unconscious nature of many cognitive processes. The importance of early childhood development for the life of the mind. I mean, this is another obvious, nobody doubts this anymore, adverse childhood experiences. It's, you know, these are fundamentally important. And so on. I could carry on listing many other achievements. But for me, you asked me, what is the, oh, that's my phone, my God.
You can answer it.
Suspected spam. It actually says that. Sorry. Ek vra verskoning. So to come back to what I was saying, what Damiaan asked me was, what is the essence of Freud's contribution,
because,
the main contribution?
Did many things, yeah.
I would say, and it might sound a little obscure, so just bear with me for a second. I think that Freud's main contribution was to recognize that the mind does work on behalf of the organism as a whole. In other words, the mind is embodied. The mind does biological work. It's part of nature. There's this thing that Freud called psychical reality, in other words, the subjective part of nature, which, hello, it exists, you know, yeah, we're busy experiencing it. This is part of nature,
yeah.
That it does something, that it has to be integrated into an understanding of the organism as a whole. So Freud's definition of what he called Trieb, drive in English, was that it's a measure of the demand made upon the mind to perform work on behalf of the organism as a whole. It's due to the embodied nature of the mind. So, I mean, I could elaborate on that a great deal, but just to say in a few words, for me, that was Freud's main contribution, that the mind does work on behalf of the organism as a whole. It's in a way saying what I said earlier in different words, you know, that you can't understand how the human organism functions if you don't take account of the part played by the mind in all of this. And Freud's attempt, which is a profound attempt, to integrate mental subjective experience into our natural scientific Weltanschauung, that I think was his greatest contribution.
But you know, you don't need unconscious for that.
You don't need an unconscious?
Yeah, you could do that without unconscious.
Do you mean without consciousness or without the unconscious?
Well, without the concept of unconscious.
Well, yeah, I don't think, this is why I said, you asked me what was Freud's major contribution. I said I could list these things. One of them was the unconscious, which, as I say, we don't even realize anymore in cognitive science theory that this was Freud's idea. But I don't think that was the fundamental starting point. I think the fundamental starting point was to try to integrate subjectivity, in other words, what he called psychical reality, into our natural scientific conception of the universe. And you don't need an unconscious to do that. That's a discovery. I mean, in Freud's attempt to understand subjective experience, he was led to recognize that subjective experience is not transparent to itself, that there are sort of inconsistencies and ruptures in the causal sequence of conscious events, which required him to infer there must be other events going on here which are not conscious. And so it flows from his efforts. It wasn't a kind of a postulate that he worked from.
You write about it in your book. So, and I would like to contradict it with a quote of Dostoevsky. So Dostoevsky writes in Crime and Punishment, "Talking nonsense is man's only privilege that distinguish him from all other organisms." And in your book, you're saying, Freud faced a dilemma. Either conscious thought is complete, but often nonsensical, or some of the thoughts that make it intelligible must be unconscious. So to you, it was like a proof that Freud, he chose the second option. But my question to you is, why should nonsense always conceal a hidden meaning?
Well, first of all, let me contradict Dostoevsky. Although it's true that only we can talk nonsense, it's also true that only we can talk. So obviously, for that reason, only we can talk nonsense. I certainly, anybody who's got pet dogs like I have, some Labradors, they can do nonsense, although they can't talk nonsense.
Bark nonsense.
Bark nonsense and other do other nonsensical things. But I take the point, and it goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about it being a discovery. And Freud didn't start with the postulate of the unconscious. You say, why can't it be otherwise? Well, in principle, it could be otherwise, but it isn't otherwise. So Freud inferred in between, the patient, this happens to the patient, and next thing they're doing that, and you clearly that this event makes sense of this action, but the patient has no awareness that why they're doing this is a product of that. So you have to infer, well, in between there's a belief or an influence of past events exerting effects upon the patient's behavior, and you need to say, well, they're not aware of that, therefore these are unconscious mental processes. That was just a purely empirical inference. It's not an a priori assumption that it must be so, but it's very important to remember, which I alluded to, that this is no longer just a clinical conjecture. I mean, there is oceans of experimental evidence that exactly that happens. For example, using a tachistoscope which presents information visually to a research participant for milliseconds, objectively that information has been presented. You can measure in the visual cortex that the visual information has been registered, but it was so brief that the person has no experience of it. They say, I saw nothing, and yet the content of that instruction or message, whatever the case may be, like saying, showing two faces, saying this one's a rapist, this one's a philanthropist. Afterwards you say, which one do you prefer? Everyone prefers the philanthropist, even though they have no conscious memory of having ever seen this face and the description of the person before. So it's demonstrably, really solidly proven.
Yeah, but still, I think scientifically, the idea of an unconscious is kind of risky. So one of my personal struggles with psychoanalysis, both theoretically and practically, is this risk of over-interpretation. I have the idea when I'm in supervision, intervision, whatsoever, everything must have a meaning. there is no meaninglessness in psychoanalysis. So do you recognize that risk and the risk of over-interpretation? So where comes this refusal of tolerance of nonsense from?
Yeah. So let me just say something else, bridging between your previous question and this one, because I think it's important that our audience not necessarily believes this, but understands that this is where I'm coming from, and where I'm coming from is building upon where Freud was coming from. If the brain and the mind are just two different perspectives upon the same part of reality, which was Freud's fundamental metaphysical position. That's not, the one isn't more real than the other, the one doesn't produce the other. They're just two ways of observing. Otherwise, either externally, objectively, you see a brain, or internally, subjectively, you experience a mind. They're just two ways of registering the same thing. If that is the case, we need to take account of the fact that many brain processes do not give rise to conscious experience. So in order to have a science of the mind, Freud was saying, therefore we have to include also these unconscious mental events and call them mental. They are the subjective but not known. They are part of the subjective point of view. They are the mind, but not all of the mind is conscious. I just wanted to make that sort of point clear, because it makes possible an independent science of the mind. Otherwise, you constantly have to be saying, well, now here's a mental event, now there's a brain event that caused the next mental event, and then there's another brain event, and then you're in a very weird place. But the gosh, now I lost my track about what you were saying about.
So the risk of
over-interpretation.
Yes, because the assumption everything has a meaning.
Yep, I'm afraid that's correct. It's a real risk.
How did you deal with it?
Well, first of all, you must remember I started out in the neurosciences, and then I thought what's missing is the subjective side of it. And, let me go and train in psychoanalysis. Well, there was a few surprises there too, which was, there's good psychoanalysis and then there's anything goes. Yeah. And I was quite taken aback when I first started training in psychoanalysis, how a patient would be presented, and then the one colleague would say, I think this is going on, and then the other colleague says, I think that is going on. It just seemed okay, that everybody just had their version of the patient, and that there was no possibility of agreement. So I think that this is why, one of the major reasons why the interdisciplinary effort that's come to be known as neuropsychoanalysis, why I felt the necessity for us to do that. There's a need to constrain psychoanalytical theory building. And for all of the strengths of the psychoanalytic method, its major strength being that its starting point is subjective experience. And then it's a matter of, let me try and infer from the actual lived life what mechanisms lie behind this. The inferences that you come to on that basis are not experimentally testable by the psychoanalytic method. There is a rough and ready way in which you put your hypothesis to the patient, and if you're a decent clinician, you're guided by how they respond, but it's very rough and ready. It's really not anything like an experimental method. So the fact that we now have all these other tools at our disposal, where in science, actually quite generally, every method has its strengths and its weaknesses. So the best way to proceed is to use multiple methods which offset, the strengths of the one offset the weaknesses of the other, and vice versa. So I think that's the way forwards, and that's what I've been doing over the last several decades, is that we must make use of all the tools we've got, the objective methods, to constrain the subjective methods, but not to throw the baby out with the bathwater in the process.
So you argue that the unconscious it's not at all a mystical concept, that's clear, but it's a biological reality. So how does the brain actively keep painful emotional truth outside our reflective awareness? How does it work?
Well, there are two steps to this, and I'm sorry if I sound dogmatic. I'm just giving a very brief answer. But if you read my book, you'll be able to see all the evidence spelt out there. But in short, first, we human beings, whatever else we are, Homo sapiens is a species of animal, and we have phenotypic needs just like every other species, and we feel those needs. Pleasant feelings mean my needs are being satisfied, unpleasant feelings mean my needs are being frustrated, and that goes from bodily needs to emotional needs. The same principle applies. So a feeling, an unpleasant feeling, just tells you a need is not being met. So if I feel hungry, my nutritional need is not being met. Likewise, if I feel fear, it means my need for safety is not being met. It's the same thing, whether it's a bodily need or an emotional need. So feelings simply mean whatever I'm doing to satisfy this need. I'm putting it in the first person. We don't think this, but this is what it means. Whatever I'm doing to meet this need isn't working. The feeling tells you. So that's step one. Step two, again, I'm sure you all know this from your own experience. None of us take suffering, passively and willingly. So then we institute defenses against those feelings. How do I get rid of this feeling? The best way of getting rid of a bad feeling is finding a better way to meet the underlying need. So that's what our treatment is all about. Going back to your first question, that's what our cure is all about. I don't mind putting it so simply, because it's a virtue in the life of the mind which is so complex. Psychotherapy, psychoanalytical psychotherapy, is just a method of helping our patients find better ways of meeting their emotional needs. So the one way in which you can deal with bad feelings is you can recognize this means this need's not being met. You need to do something differently, which people resist amazingly. They don't want to change what they do. And the other thing to do is defense mechanisms, fudges, ways of getting rid of the feeling. And it's very simple. It's like drinking yourself into oblivion. Many a drinker will tell you, this is how I cope with my feelings. That's the second kind of solution.
So how does it work specifically? So psychoanalysis, the affect feelings are, it's felt before it's known. So is the goal of psychoanalysis, is the work making feelings more thinkable, or is it bringing back those feelings into awareness so that I can experience them more thoroughly? Is it both, or is it one?
It is both, but it is mainly the former. So let me just explain that for a moment. Mostly our patients come to us when their defenses fail them. So if their defenses are working, they're not suffering and they don't come to us, even though it comes at a cost to them. But nevertheless, if their defenses are intact, there's no motivation to come for treatment. The exceptions there are children, first of all, their parents send them to us. Adolescents, their parents send them to us. And so you get many a defended adolescent coming to therapy who's not coming there willingly. And another group with eating disorders being in between the two is addicts. Addicts, I've seldom met an addict who didn't think that, unlike every other addict, they've got their addiction under control. So these are patients, eating disorders, addictions, adolescents, and so on. They certainly come to us because everyone else is worried about them. They're not worried about themselves. Their families, their doctors are worried. But for the rest, our patients come to us of their own volition because they're suffering. So those patients who come to us with intact defenses, the first task is to put them in touch with their feelings, to make them aware you're doing this like taking drugs.
The feelings.
Instead of not, in order not to feel that, you're doing this. So that's a different kind of intervention from once the patient actually feels their suffering, and even the most defended patient, the suffering breaks through. There are moments when it breaks through, and those are, sadly for the patient, it's painful, but for the treatment, these are very valuable moments where both of you see the truth of it. Actually, this is what you feel. Then the task becomes understanding why is the patient feeling this? And that is, I'm sorry, again, I'm very painfully aware how dogmatic and didactic I'm being, but I'm trying to compress it all into a few sentences.
So why do you think it's dogmatic?
Because I'm self-conscious.
Okay, but keep it this way.
Just to finish that thought, though, then the task becomes the patient has feelings and they don't know where they come from.
Yeah.
They don't know why they're suffering. They don't know why they're depressed, why they're anxious, etc. And so the task then becomes making sense of. So that's connecting the cognitive side of life, the knowing.
So the insightfulness is still a very important.
Absolutely. In order so the crux of the cure is for the patient to understand, I'm feeling this because of that. These things happened. The way that I've dealt with those things is to live my life in such and such way. And although I'm it's easy for me to understand that as a child this was the best solution I could come up with. Now it's not serving me well anymore.
So you would say insight still is the cornerstone of psychoanalysis.
I do think so, absolutely.
Yeah. So I would like to ask you to interpret the famous quote of Freud, "Wo es war, soll ich werden." Because you have a particular interpretation of that quote. Could you go into that one?
Sure.
Explain what it means traditionally. Yeah.
So in this, let me just go back a step. This book, The Only Cure.
This one.
This one, yeah. The reason it's prehistory is that I translate or revise the translation of Freud's works from German into English. And my publishers wanted me to, they thought this is too good an opportunity to miss. You must write something about Freud because, you know, this was a big literary moment that the new standard edition of Freud in English had come out. And they wanted me to write something about translating Freud. And I thought that's not really a sufficient, interesting to a sufficient number of people. So that's why it ended up being a book about translation in the scientific sense, translating Freud's ideas into neuroscientific language that we can understand in the 21st century, and in this way building a bridge between the disciplines and between, you know, the origins of the field and its potential today. But the other meaning of the word translation did also come into the book, and there's one chapter devoted to that, to the more linguistic meaning of the word translation. And that particular sentence that you've just quoted, wo es war, soll ich werden, is a sentence which was absolutely pummeled to death by Jacques Lacan. He absolutely, you know, analyzed each and every word and every combination of words in that sentence, you know, in order to get to the depths of the meaning of what Freud was actually trying to say. You know, the French way, and why Strachey got it so horribly wrong. Strachey was my predecessor in the translation of Freud into English. And so I quoted that sentence in order to discuss this question of all of the minutiae of the translation of Freud and why people get so exercised about these words and so on. But honestly, in my view, nothing could be plainer than the meaning of that. In fact, I'm in the right country to tell you. Freud goes on, after that sentence, he goes on to say, it's a little bit like the draining of the Zee de Zeer. What we're doing, you know, is reclaiming land from the ocean. So the wo es war, where it was,
which is the unconscious?
Where the unconscious was, where the part that is unknown to you was, let it be known to you. It must become ish, it must become part of me. So where this thing that was a part of my own mental life, but not under my possession, you know, like the oceans just on the coast of the Netherlands, and let me take these lands and make them part of the
territorium country.
Yeah,
that's
all it means.
Yeah.
For all of the gymnastics that Lacan got up to, interesting as they were, I don't think it's a very difficult sentence to understand.
But in terms of your appreciation of the conscious, you should turn it upside down, no? Because you have a completely different perspective on unconscious and conscious.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad you said that, because when we introduced this conversation this evening, the question was posed, you know, was Freud right all along, sort of thing. And honestly, I don't think that's the. I mean, it's an interesting question in the sense of being fair to Freud. I mean, doing justice to somebody who really was a great pioneer in the science of the mind. But, it's not a question of whether Freud was right or wrong. In fact, I was once interviewed for an American news magazine, and the author of it was a Newsweek, and the author of the article was Fred Guttel. And right at the end of the article, he said, it's not a matter of proving Freud right or wrong, it's a matter of finishing the job. So he was trying to describe that's what this Solms guy is trying to do. And I really think that that's a better way of describing what we're up to in neuropsychoanalysis. So all of that by way of answering your question. Freud didn't get everything right. And one of the fundamental errors that Freud made was to equate, in his early work, he divided the mind into a conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious functional systems. Domain, and then later on he realized, for complicated reasons that I won't go into, that we need to conceptualize it somewhat differently, and he divided it into ego, superego, and id. This is the problem. He said that the id, which is where the drives are, that he conflated that with the unconscious and made it into one system. And that's highly problematical for a great many reasons. For one thing, drives are not the same thing as representational structures. The drives cathect, to use Strachey's word, they besetz, they occupy, they activate the representational structures. They're not the same thing. Much more importantly is that those representational structures may, and indeed for the very most part, are unconscious. They may be unconscious, they are unconscious. The activating forces, as I was explaining earlier, about needs, how do you become aware of what it is that you need? What is it that drives you? It's feelings. So, we have autonomic functions like you constantly burning up the sugar deposits in your fatty tissues. That's how you're meeting your energy needs. You don't feel it. And it's not a drive. It only becomes a drive when it starts to make demands on the mind for work, which was Freud's definition of drive. How does that demand come about? You feel it. I'm hungry. Now you have a drive. So for very complicated reasons that we can't go into here, I realized that this was a mistake, that we, as much as certainly there's a very large part of the mind that's unconscious, it's not the same part of the mind as the part that Freud called the id. In other words, the part that does the function of driving the mind. So I think, to put it in as simple a way as I can, the unconscious, you're cognitively unconscious of what it is that's motivating you, but you're affectively all too conscious. You're aware of the feeling, you just don't know where the feeling comes from. You can't explain it, you don't know its origins, you don't know its purpose.
But that sounds like a complete reversal of Freud's opinion. So the affects, feelings are conscious, and the theoretical constructions are unconscious.
Yes, so the id is conscious. I wrote a paper called The Conscious Id in 2013, and I myself found it seriously difficult to get my head around this, the idea of a conscious id. But let me supplement what I've just said to link it back to what I was saying earlier about the need to constrain our theory by using not only the psychoanalytic method, but also all of the neuroscientific methods now at our disposal. The part of the brain that performs the function that Freud called drive, in other words, the part of the brain that is regulating, monitoring the homeostatic needs of the organism and making demands upon the mind, these are deep brainstem structures. Those very same deep brainstem structures are the structures which give rise to raw affect. And these are statements that are deeply grounded in empirical evidence. The reticular activating system of the midbrain and the periaqueductal gray, these are primitive brainstem structures, ancient, 550 million years old. This is the font of all consciousness, comes from down there. And this is where the drives come from too. So the drives, arousal, affect, consciousness are all deeply bound up with each other. not with the cortex. The cortex, which is the representational, cognitive, and much more evolutionarily recent part of the brain, this part of the brain only becomes conscious when it is aroused, activated from below. Freud's view was that consciousness is attached to the cortex. Where did Freud get that view from? From his neuroscientific training. Everybody was trained that. I was trained in the same tradition. The cortex, and Freud says this many times. He says, in claiming that consciousness is a perceptual function, that it is at the top end of the mind, we are simply following the what we've learned from the cerebral anatomists. Turns out the cerebral anatomists were wrong. So, consciousness is not primarily a cortical function. The cortex is only rendered conscious by the upper brain stem, and the upper brain stem is the part of the brain that performs the functions that Freud called drive. So there we have to correct it. But now, if I can just, Damiaan, add one more thing, that it's not a matter of just, if neuroscience tells us that it works differently from how psychoanalysis tells us it works, then neuroscience is right. That's not it's very important that we take evidence from the neurosciences and then say, well, let's see if we apply this concept to what we observe clinically and do clinically, if that makes better sense and leads to better outcomes, then we will take this. It's a two-way street. It's very important.
But conceptually, it is a big difference with the majority of the literature in psychoanalysis.
It's not a matter of proving Freud right or wrong. It's a matter of finishing the job.
So, but on the same account, one of the major pillars of your book is the clinical use of transference. We spoke about it. So, for an audience unfamiliar with psychoanalysis, how does the therapist use the live relationship in the room to transform an unconscious non-verbal memory? How does it work, and what is your perspective on transference?
Well, I think that transference, when you asked me earlier on in this conversation what was Freud's greatest contribution, that's one of them that's up there. Transference is a fundamental concept, an enormous discovery of Freud's. So let me just briefly explain to those who are not au fait with the psychoanalytical terminology. Transference is a phenomenon, a very robust phenomenon that we see all around us all the time, whereby in childhood we come to certain solutions. This is how I'm going to meet this need. This is how I'm going to resolve this conflict. And then it becomes automatized. Once the child is, no longer thinking and feeling their way through this problem, they said it works like this, then it becomes automatized. This is a general sort of principle about how we call it systems consolidation in neuroscience. Things that were conscious become what Freud called pre-conscious. That means declarative long-term memory. Eventually they become unconscious, what we nowadays call non-declarative long-term memory. And then they're no longer thinkable. We're talking about subcortical structures like the basal ganglia, the amygdala, the cerebellum, and so on. These don't make images like the cortex does. Images that you can think, that's cortical. These are action policies. They're motor systems, they're response systems. And so Freud put it like this. Freud said, the unconscious is repeated rather than remembered. In other words, it's enacted rather than thought. And that's how we understand it in neuroscience, how we understand So transference is transferring your childhood solutions, the solutions you found with your childhood relationships, transferring those solutions onto present-day relationships. And remember, the crucial thing is that you are not a child, and the people that you're transferring these attitudes to are not your parents or your siblings. So it's treating present-day relationships as if they were the same as the childhood relationships. So the best solutions the child could come up with then, under those circumstances, get repeated stereotypically and transferred onto the present as if they were still the best that the person could come up with. So the problematizing of transference. The making the patient aware, can you see you're doing this? It's meant to have this outcome. Can you see that this is not having that outcome? That's problem, and that it's treating the present as if it were the past, and it's not the past. I mean, I'm sort of parodying it, but that's the essence of what we do.
But it's basically transferring in time from past to present.
That's right.
And in a very determined way.
Yep. And it provides the patient with an opportunity then to find better ways, as I said, than their childhood ways. By problematizing the transference, it provides the patient with an opportunity to no longer compulsively, automatically just do the same old thing, but rather to think and feel their way through the problem afresh with their adult mind in their adult circumstances.
But how does it work? I mean, if you from childhood on have these automatic responses, non-declarative, you can't change them, and you transfer them all the time, once triggered from the past to the present in your relation to other ones, how do you change it as a therapist?
Well, this is one of the reasons why self-analysis is so difficult. It's much easier to see what somebody else is doing than to see yourself what you're doing. So to have the essence of the psychoanalytical method is to, interpreting the transference is to make the patient aware that what they're doing is this, that they're repeating this. They can't remember, but they can see what they're doing. So it's drawing attention to something that the patient is doing in the present. This is how it's possible to make the unconscious conscious. It's not possible to remember it. It's literally impossible in terms of what I was saying earlier. These aren't even representational structures. So that's the essence of the treatment.
Is that the reason why the reconstruction takes so much time?
The reason why it takes time, it's not so much the reconstruction as as we call it, the reconsolidation. Nowadays, everyone's very happy-clappy about the plasticity of the brain. The brain changes itself. Well, the sad news is there are parts of the brain that are very plastic. There are other parts which are anything but plastic. Yeah. So when it comes to the non-declarative memory systems, what Freud called the unconscious, in cognitive neuroscience we have a phrase that these memories are hard to learn and hard to forget. So the changing of things that are in these unconscious memory systems, it takes time. It's the reconsolidation, the change. This is what we call resistance. There's a great resistance to doing this. The upside, I mean, what's in our favor is that the new ways of going about meeting your needs and solving life's problems, the adult ways, the considered ways, they work better.
They should be better, should be a solution at least. Yeah.
So we call it working through. You've got to go over it again and again and again. And it's really, if I may add, it's important for healthcare funders and healthcare policymakers and so on to recognize that's just how this part of the brain works. It's slow. It's like saying, this is why we need lots of sessions. It's not as if we want to make our treatments as long as possible. It's like saying, sorry, kidney dysfunction, requires daily dialysis. It's too expensive, too much time. I'll just give it to you once a month. The patient will die. Yeah. And that's just because that's how the kidney works. And this is the same. This is how this part of the organism works. The unconscious memory systems work slowly.
Yeah, it makes sense. I will use that argument next time when I have a conversation with a health insurance company.
Good.
So let's shift gears and move a bit to the neuropsychoanalysis. You're one of the founders of neuropsychoanalysis. So for a mixed audience, what is neuropsychoanalysis?
Well, it's very simple. As I said earlier, I started out in the neurosciences. I felt what was missing was something about the subjective side of things. I then trained in the subjective side of things, psychoanalysis, and felt, well, what's missing here is a bit of scientific rigor. So, let's combine the two. It's simply, neuropsychoanalysis is simply taking advantage of the fact that this part of nature, what Freud called the Seelenapparat, the apparatus of the mind, the instrument of the mind, this part of nature can be studied from two different perspectives, both the objective physical perspective and the subjective psychological perspective, and let's integrate these two perspectives with each other. That's neuropsychoanalysis. I must just tell you a slightly amusing thing, that how the word neuropsychoanalysis came about was in 1999. By then there were a sufficient number of people beginning to be interested in this interdisciplinary effort. We decided we must start a journal. And we needed a name for the journal. And so we were just sitting there tossing about what can we call this journal. That's how the name neuropsychoanalysis came about. It was the title of a journal, and it ended up being the name of the field.
And now it's a movement. So, but when I try to understand it, is it? I mean, there are many goals. Is it an attempt to rehabilitate Freud as a serious scientist? Is it an attempt to translate Freud into contemporary neuroscience? Is it an attempt to correct Freud with our neuroscience, what we now nowadays know? Or is it a survival strategy in general for psychoanalysis, which is threatened?
I think it's in a way many of the things you've just enumerated, but I think it's important to understand what the fundamental priorities are and what the nice-to-have sort of add-on benefits are. So to start with the nice-to-have add-on benefits, what you said at the end about a survival strategy, it is. I think that in the 21st century, to have a serious contender within the sciences of the mind and the treatment modalities available to the population, if you have one that is not in any way linked to science, it's not in any way based in the normal ways in which one gathers and reports evidence and so on, it's going to have a limited lifespan. So I think it is good for the future survival of psychoanalysis that we have this attempt to integrate it with the neurosciences and all that goes with that. But that's not what motivated us. Those of us who developed this field, we weren't sort of thinking, well, how can we market psychoanalysis in a better way that it looks like as if it's a science when we know it's not? It was much more, how can we take the enormously valuable insights that Freud and psychoanalysis gave us, precisely because, as I said, it was the discipline that studied the brain from this point of view of being a brain. And as I said, there's a great deal you'll never understand about it if you don't take account of the fact that this reveals a great deal about and explains a great deal about what we do. There was a real risk. Remember, I started from the other side. There was a real risk in neuroscience of us being so reductionist and so materialist and so focused on the details and losing sight of the bigger picture, that we would lose that. We would lose again, I'll quote Sachs, that we will lose the psyche in neuropsychology. So that was really the fundamental motivation behind neuropsychoanalysis is how can we save the subjective perspective and all that it reveals to us and all that it is to us, because don't forget, what are we if not subjects? It's not just a philosophical perspective. It's what's missing in psychiatry.
I highly respect this ambition, but still I'm a bit skeptical. So you want to bring subjectivity into neuroscience, but as far as I know neuroscience, how can neuroscience explain subjective experience without translating it in something objective and thereby losing precisely what it wants to explain? So my personal experience is that, these are two difficult and completely different fields. You need different minds, different approaches, different characters. How do you explain subjective feelings of I don't know, Kafka, films, movies into an objective neuron and neurotransmitters?
So I think that the way to approach this is to remember Freud started with experience, the reported phenomenology of free associations and so on. And then he's not a phenomenologist. From that, the task is, what can we infer about the underlying mechanisms? And that's what I said earlier Freud called the Seelenapparat. What Freud called it metapsychology. It's an attempt to discern the underlying structures, forces, the lawful organization of some sort of functional system that explains, that causes the experiences. So psychoanalysis as a science wasn't descriptive phenomenology. It wasn't just subjectivity. It is what can we discern about the underlying mechanisms from the subjective experiences.
It was neuropsychoanalysis from the beginning on.
Well, it was, the neuro part was missing because there were no methods. So what neuroscience does, I mean, speaking as a cognitive neuroscientist, I don't just look at neurons or look at the lesions in my patient's brains and say, wow, look there's a hole. You know, it's the patient with a lesion there can't do this, but can do that. What does that tell us about the underlying organization? So in cognitive neuroscience, we speak about things like memory systems, language systems, perceptual systems, executive systems, and so on. These are abstractions. These are exactly like Freud's metapsychology. These are functional, it's describing the underlying organization of the entity that we abstract from the two surfaces of observation. So that's what the common ground between neuroscience and psychoanalysis is. We wanting to understand what makes it tick. What are the underlying organizing principles? We don't want to just describe the surface phenomena. We want to infer the mechanisms from them. So that's what we're trying to do. It's not reducing the one to the other. No. It's explaining them both in terms of an underlying monistic ontology.
So speaking about monism, I mean, in the mind-brain debate, you could say, could you say that you're a dual aspect monist? And first of all, do you accept that description, and what does it mean?
So I will tell you first of all what it means, and then I'll tell you.
That's a good order.
So when I wake up in the morning with my eyes closed, I feel myself to be alive. Mark Solms is alive, thank God for that. That's my mind. Then I get out of bed and I stagger over to the bathroom and I look in the mirror and I see this body, you know, and I say, further evidence, Mark Solms is alive, thank God for that. Now we face a fundamental question. Are there two Mark Solmses, you know, the body and the mind, or is there only one Mark Solms? Dual aspect monism simply says there's only one Mark Solms. The one Mark Solms is an abstraction. Mark Solms is the entity that you both experience as the mind if you are him, and that you observe as the body if you are not him. So dual aspect monism just says this. Externally observing the body and brain is just one aspect, one perspectival, observational sort of vantage point upon the same thing, the same part of nature that we observe subjectively as our minds. So crucially, that means the one doesn't cause the other. You can't reduce the one to the other any more than you can't, like lightning you see with your eyes, thunder you hear with your ears, kababa-boomba. You don't say, did the thunder cause the lightning or did the lightning cause the thunder? They're both caused by something that you infer called this, you know, this geoelectrical thing about the potential difference, you know, between here in the atmosphere, and the electrons all go zoomp to reduce that difference. That explains both of them. So that's what dual aspect monism is. Now, I need to add one little funny twist to this. Because I'm a neuropsychologist, you know, you've got to have some understanding of, or some position on how do mind and brain relate to each other, because that's what neuropsychology is all about. And I was really struggling with this, you know, as a youngster. And eventually, somewhere in my 20s or late 20s, I came up with this. I thought it must be like that, what I just described to you. You know, this waking up in the morning and going to the bathroom sort of thing. That must be it. They're just two observational points of view on the same part of nature. And I thought, wow, that's great. And so I went and started speaking to my colleagues, some of whom are philosophers, and they said, but that's what Spinoza said, you know, 400 years ago. So I thought I'd, you know, solved some sort of problem. Yeah. But it's good old Spinoza, dual aspect monism.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. And he lived here.
Yeah. But okay, so two perspectives, but basically you're idea is that everything is rooted, or it's a materialistic perspective. Everything depends on the brain, on the body.
No, it's not a materialistic perspective. It's a physicalistic perspective in the sense of physics. In other words, the ultimate causes that explain phenomena. That's what physics is about. But that is not reducible to matter. In fact, in contemporary quantum physics, matter isn't even a fundamental concept. So it's not what you can touch only. It's not matter. Einstein's E equals mc squared shows that matter can be transmuted into energy.
In the end, you can't touch nothing.
So materialism, I'm not a materialist.
No.
I'm a physicalist, but I believe that in physics we also have to include and account for subjective phenomena. They're part of nature. There's nothing spooky about it. So a materialist says it's all matter. An idealist says it's all mind. A dual aspect monist says no, it's the underlying forces that explain, causally account for both sets of observations. And I really do see it that way.
So you're not saying that you can reduce justice to a particular physical process now, but it could be possible if we wait long enough with sufficient methods. It could be describable in terms of physicalistic concepts.
So that's a different question. That's not an ontological question. It's
epistemological.
It's an epistemological one. And there, what I have to say is not particularly interesting or original, which is simply this: everything in every science has to ultimately be consistent with the most basic science, has to be consistent with it. In other words, you can't have explanations about the law or about the weather or about psychology which break the rules of physics. It doesn't mean that physics, with its methods and its concepts, is the most useful way to do psychology or law or whatever the other thing, meteorology. I think that each discipline, that there are levels of organization where different phenomena come into existence and different concepts are required to explain those phenomena. They can't contradict the basic laws, but they're not all reducible to the basic laws are not the best way to explain the phenomena.
No. Okay. So one of the core concepts in your model, neuropsychoanalysis, is homeostasis. And you approach it affectively and cognitively. It's one model for both expressions. So I was wondering if the organism strives toward homeostasis, you call it even the nirvana principle, less tension, less surprise, less uncertainty, less prediction error. I was wondering what kind of subjective experience happens over there at that time when you reach that point. Is it like boredom? Is it physical deadness? Is it pleasure? Is it what is it that or can we reach it anyway?
Thank you. So let me just say quickly first, homeostasis is a very good example of what I was talking about under the heading of dual aspect monism. Homeostasis is a fundamental mechanism which explains basically everything about living tissue, living organisms. They are fundamentally governed by homeostasis, and the same applies to the life of the mind. It's fundamentally governed by homeostasis, which is feelings are an extended version of homeostasis. Am I moving out of homeostasis or into it? Am I going away from where I need to be, my viable preferred states, or am I moving towards them? Unpleasure, pleasure. So feeling, the absolute sort of basic stuff of mental life, and the fundamental physiological principles governing the body are both explicable in terms of homeostasis. And if I may just squeeze in there also, in terms of your earlier question about disciplines, in physics, this shouldn't be possible. Homeostasis works against entropy. It works against the second law of thermodynamics. According to the second law of thermodynamics, things don't move toward order, they move toward disorder. And this is a good illustration of my point that ultimately we can't break the laws of physics. That's why, sorry to tell you, we all die. Because in the end, homeostasis fails and the second law of thermodynamics wins. But while we're alive, we keep at it. And then to your question, if we are in homeostasis, what do we feel? And you listed a number of possibilities. I would say something like nirvana is what we feel if we're in homeostasis. In other words, you could say you're in the flow, there's no perturbation, everything's just absolutely swimming along exactly in the zone.
So there is
not boredom.
No, okay.
Boredom, one of our basic needs, different scientists have different words for it. Panksepp calls it seeking, Berridge calls it wanting. It's a need to engage with what's uncertain, to engage with what's novel, to engage with what's not known. And so you satisfy that need by novelty, excitement, interest in the new and the unknown. And you frustrate that need, you have boredom. So that's a need not met. That's not homeostasis.
Need to be corrected.
Yeah. So homeostasis is more like Freud actually spoke of a nirvana principle. He originally thought that the life of the mind is governed by a pleasure principle. And then in 1920, he published this famous book, Jenseits des Lustprinzips, where he says there's something beyond the pleasure principle, something deeper. We're not seeking pleasure, we're seeking nirvana. And then he comes up with this nirvana principle. And I think that's as good a way as you can describe homeostasis. Unpleasure and pleasure are measures of moving away from and toward where we ultimately want to be, which is in homeostasis, which is no needs, no perturbation, no tension,
but in
nothing.
one single day, Mark, for example, you get up, you look at the mirror, you say, oh, that's Mark. So how many times are you in homeostasis?
Oh, well, never.
Okay.
There are highly artificial ways of achieving nirvana, and I really need to emphasize that they're highly artificial. And I mean no disrespect to any people who practice these techniques. Meditation, these Eastern meditative practices, they do bring about states like nirvana. But that's not the normal way in which the organism functions. So that's why I say it's a highly artificial, top-down, acquired skill. And just as I said about the second law of thermodynamics, which ultimately wins and we die, so too with this nirvana state. I mean, even the Buddha had to shit eventually.
Yeah, but still, I mean, you can be enlightened. So that's the equivalent a little bit of the nirvana principle. It's possible, but it's highly unlikely.
I think it's possible for moments of time in highly artificial conditions. In the ordinary run of things, we're never in homeostasis.
Okay.
It's a matter of not, am I finally in a state of no need? It's more a matter of, which need do I have to prioritize now?
Okay. So
my favorite need to prioritize is sleep. It comes the closest to nirvana.
yeah. But you have to wake up.
Yep.
Yeah. So another thing that your model is beautiful, and the more I read about it, the more I feel like a groupie. I will become a groupie. But some things, Kernberg called it minor disagreements, I can say. So if we talk about transference and countertransference, you talked about transferring from the past to the present, but of course in psychoanalysis it means a therapeutic relationship between two people. And there's a lot of attention now for relational aspects, the third dimension, intersubjectivity and so on. So how does your model account for what emerges between two people being in contact with each other?
Well, I think that what we spoke about earlier under the heading of transference is probably a good place to begin to answer that. I am relating to my analyst on the basis of my transference. I'm transferring certain ways of being, ways of doing things, certain expectations onto the analyst. If it were not an analyst, they would be responding in terms of their expectations, needs, and so on. And there you have all of the tensions of interpersonal relationships. Psychoanalysis is another highly artificial situation where the analyst, rather than responding to you, in terms of their needs and their transferences, they hold this extraordinary position of neutrality and trying to understand why you're doing what you're doing rather than responding to what you're doing. And by the way, I think that this is a very important part of how psychoanalysis works, that you only have to be with your patient for 50 minutes. If you actually had to live with your patient, it would be very hard, to do this, to just hold this attempt to understand, and that's all that you're doing. But that is the relational thing that you're talking about. It's transference and counter-transference. And so, when the fact that I don't emphasize that in terms of trying to understand how the individual mind works doesn't mean that I don't recognize that fundamentally psychoanalysis is a relational activity. It's a two-person business.
But it seems that your model fits the one-person approach, and that nowadays we talk about the two-person psychology.
It's often said that, and I don't agree with that. Let me say two things about that. First of all, you spoke about how we in neuropsychoanalysis have said that Freud was wrong about the id being unconscious. What we've also said is Freud was wrong about his classification of the drives. They're not two drives. They're, as best we understand it, as far as emotional drives are concerned, they're 7. If you include the bodily drives, there's many, many more than 7. So we've revised a Freudian drive theory too. And in the revised drive theory, Freud said drives are objectless. In the revised drive theory, each drive is object-related. So there's a fear drive, which implies a dangerous object. There's an attachment drive, which implies a caregiving object. There's a rage drive, which implies a frustrating object, and so on. So this is an advance over the old drive theory, and Freud always predicted that his drive theory would be replaced by a new one coming from biology. So it's intrinsically, even just our drive theory, it's intrinsically two-person. There's an object relationship. It's like what Bion, those of you who analysts will know, Bion spoke of a preconception. So there's a preconception of the breast, then you meet an actual breast, and then it sort of clicks into
what's always there.
So
this is how fantasy.
This is how the drives work. And then second thing I wanted to say on that score, think about affect. Perception is outward. It's you perceive objects. Inwardly, you feel. So affect is how you perceive the subject. Perception is how you perceive objects. And how do you know what your patient is feeling? You don't see it, you feel it. So this counter-transference includes this very, very fundamentally. So it's a matter of I feel something on the basis of what's happening between the two of us. What part of this has to do with me? What part of this has to do with my patient? It's a fundamentally relational, interpersonal, subjective field going on all the time. I don't understand why. Because this is a criticism I've often heard, that neuropsychoanalysis is a one-person.
Probably not an accident, so it's not a coincidence.
There's somebody waving at me.
Okay, so one final question, because I'm afraid we have to end. But I would like to ask you, because you start the book with this very interesting observation that I would call it like a renaissance of psychoanalysis. There is a renewed interest in psychoanalysis, particularly for young people. How do you explain it socially? What's going on? Why are we interested again in psychoanalysis and Freud? And
I'm glad to end on that score for a number of reasons. One of them is I worry that I look like a know-it-all. So here's something I don't understand. Let me confess that there are many things I don't understand. And I don't know why that's happening. The fact that it's happening is true. And the fact that it's happening is welcome. Why? I would give some amateur speculation. I think one of them is look at the world. We're in a serious crisis. This whole kind of soulless political and social and communicative sort of relational world that we're in now. I think that people who are being brought up in this world must feel the lack of something. There's something wrong with all of this. So psychoanalysis is very much the other. It's a much more human, related, personal, connected perspective. I think that's a big part of it. Another thought occurred to me, but you see, that shows you how I really don't have anything profound to say about this.
I'm glad that we ended with the lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
Mark Solms, thank you very much.
Thank you. Here you are. Okay. Before the first question, I must just say the thought came back to me. It is the problem with psychiatry. I think that the banality of contemporary psychiatry has finally dawned on the public that this is not the answer. We need something else. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And also give a big round of applause to Damiaan and Denise.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. No time for dream analysis, I think. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
Hi, thank you. It was really inspiring. I just want to ask you something. Quite a lot of people do a health check. And emotions have impact on our organs. So should we also have a brain and mind check to see how we, for a health check, we don't eat less sugar, for instance? So what would you advise on that?
I think it would be a wonderful thing if that were provided by our healthcare providers, because I think that your health, your physical health, ultimately, why does your physical health matter? It's because it feels bad to be sick. It feels bad to have organs failing. It feels bad to be dying. Feelings are not unimportant even in physical medicine. So, I think that to include in a health check, how well are things going for you mentally? How well are things going for you socially, relationally, emotionally? I think it would be wonderful if that would be included. It really wouldn't be a luxury, that's what I'm trying to say. I think it really would be at the heart of the matter of what health is all about. But it will be quite a hard job to persuade the healthcare funders of that. And for them to do it properly rather than turning it into some bloody AI checklist or something.
Thank you.
About feelings. Feelings have quality. You can have good feelings and bad feelings. And I heard you say on a podcast that when you move away from homeostasis, you have a bad feeling. And when you go towards homeostasis, then you have a good feeling. But to me, my engineering brain, that's asymmetrical. I can go beyond this homeostasis and then keep good feeling until, but I think I get then in the area where you call it free energy principle, with Carl Friston. And then when you go on, you have a tipping point where you go into psychosis because there the positive feelings are becoming detached from social rules, so then you have a symmetrical complex adaptive system. But I in the survival mode, I see you or hear you explain only the asymmetrical survival side of this. Can you explain the other side?
Yeah, sure. First of all, just to say that emotions are not unrelated to survival. The reason that we feel fear, for example, is because we need to not be in danger. The reason that we feel separation distress is because we mammals need to be cared for. Juvenile mammals can't live unless they're cared for. Rage is the feeling of something standing between you and what you need, and if you don't get rid of that thing that's standing between you and what you need, you're not going to get what you need, and you're going to die. So although it's not so immediate as blood pressure or blood sugar or so on, ultimately feelings are as biological, as homeostatic as anything else. The reason that we become aware of our feelings is so that we can so that we can choose to do things differently. It's the basis of voluntary action. We don't just have reflexes. We feel that didn't work, so let me try something else. It's an enormous adaptive advantage, that feeling. And this is why I keep saying we need to include feeling in our understanding of how the brain works, of how we behave, why we do what we do. But you're saying, there's something beyond this, like, for example, in psychosis, the patient, this is not about survival. Ultimately, the mechanisms are about survival, but, you don't take the most basic principle and use it to explain every single detail in psychiatry. So, of course, there's much more detail required to explain each different psychopathology. There are many other mechanisms that come into play. But if I can just, because we have limited time, just give you the most brief indication of where such an answer lies. We have feelings, and then we have explanations for why we're feeling the way that we are. And that's not a small detail. The explanation for why am I feeling this is where you look to in order to do something differently, in order to not feel this if what you're feeling is bad. So our explanations, are coming up with explanations, are finding the hidden causes of our feeling states is a profoundly important biological requirement. To properly understand why I'm feeling what I'm feeling enables me to properly, realistically do something about it to bring me back to where I need to be. Psychosis, and again, remember, I'm being overly simplistic in the service of brevity. Psychosis is a severe disorder of that explanation of why I'm feeling what I'm feeling. And it is life-threatening to be so out of touch with a realistic account of how you come to feel the way that you do. So there's a lot more that could be said, but in this way I hope I'm indicating how psychosis too can be brought into this framework quite readily.
I'm going elsewhere because we have very little time, I'm sorry. Maybe you find each other at the bar.
Did somebody say the bar? Great.
Thank you. I would like to ask you a further elucidation of your concept of nirvana and homeostasis. Because I think you spoke about the article Beyond the Pleasure Principle of Freud. And here, I think he introduces the idea of a death drive as a way of going beyond the pleasure principle and the reality principle to understand behavior. And so my question to you is, do you believe that your homeostasis is a way of embracing life and death drive?
Thank you. Forgive me, I know I'm answering you over there, and I'm looking over here. That's because I have to both look at the camera and stay in front of the mic. So forgive me, I know I'm speaking to you. This is an example, your question is an example, or the answer to your question is an example of why neuropsychoanalysis, although I think it's a wonderful thing and I'm very glad to be able to practice in this field. I don't know why anybody does anything else. It's the most fascinating thing in the world. Nevertheless, it doesn't always bring you friends because, if you're saying to neuroscientists, I'm sorry, you got to incorporate this stuff from psychoanalysis, they don't like to hear that. Likewise, in psychoanalysis, they don't always like to hear, sorry, you got this part wrong, we've got to incorporate this from neuroscience. So you end up sort of in whilst trying to find the common ground, you kind of lose friends on both sides in the process. And one of the reasons why I've lost friends in psychoanalysis is because I think that Freud's concept of the death drive also includes errors. So Freud was right to say that the pleasure principle, that we are not ultimately looking for pleasure, we're ultimately looking for nirvana. Pleasure is a step on the way to, it's an indication that you're heading towards what biologically we would call satiation. So, hunger, chocolates, yay, great. Eventually, boy, I've had enough, and even sex, eventually you've had enough. You don't just carry on and on and on and on. Eventually you pass the pleasure and you reach satiation. That's what we're looking for. Not need, not tension, not perturbation, not demand. We want this home. It's wonderful. And as I said to you, you very seldom get that.
I was thinking if Aristotle would say that the pleasure is the eating.
Yeah, the pleasure is the eating,
The
but
pleasure
eventually
is
the pleasure ends, and then
Sure.
you reach satiation.
But it's not the end point, not the goal, not the ambition, is the activity
Oh,
itself.
well, that's a very important point. Sorry, I'm going to get back to your question, but that's a very important point, that this is one of Freud's deepest insights and contributions to the science of the mind. What motivates us is the feeling. So I said, chocolates a moment ago. Why do we eat chocolates? It's for the taste. Why do chocolates taste so nice? It's because they have high energy content. That's why over evolutionary time, sweet things are nice. We don't know, I must replenish my energy content. Let me look for a chocolate. It's like, I like the taste of chocolate. Same with sex. The reason why sex is so pleasurable is because, the species needs to reproduce. So you add a big boost of pleasure to this activity and, the species reproduces. But when I have sex, I'm not trying to reproduce. I'm not doing my biological duty. I do it because it's nice. So what motivates us is the feeling. And this was a fundamental contribution of Freud to say sex is not about reproduction. And you generalize from that, you see the importance of feelings. But to come back to the question about the death drive. So what Freud called nirvana is in fact the ideal state of life. That's to be in homeostasis, to have no perturbation, no demand, etc., is not deathly, it's the opposite. There are ways of getting to that state of mind which short circuits reality. Like, I'm in a state of separation distress. By the way, that's mediated in the brain by mu opioids. So, one way of replenishing my mu opioids, in other words, feeling warm and fuzzy, is to do the hard work of getting somebody to love me. Another way of getting there is to shoot up heroin. It also replenishes your mu opioids receptor binding. The second one, though, short circuits reality. That's what's deathly. Reality always wins. So these omnipotent fantasies that you can get to nirvana without doing the hard work of actually meeting your needs in the world, that's deathly. One more point is that Freud's inferring of a death drive, it's a very funny drive, even the way Freud describes it. It makes no demands. It makes no noise. It's not a demand. Freud's definition of a drive is it's a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work. The death drive is the exact opposite. So the death drive that Freud inferred, it's there. It's the second law of thermodynamics, which always wins, which is why we die, but I don't think it's a drive.
Thank you so much. I think there are many more questions, but we're running out of time. The auditorium has to be empty in about 10 minutes. I hope you'll manage. Please, a big hand of applause to both Damiaan and Mark.
Thank you. Well done, thank you. Good job.
I want to say, go buy his book, The Only Cure. Mark Solms, you can buy it online, and I think in our Dutch bookshops as well, in English. So do that, please. Maybe you meet him at the bar, continue our conversation. Thank you all for coming. And please leave the room a bit swiftly so our technicians have time for the next program. Thank you.